It had been some time since they had left Egypt and slavery behind. Moses and his brother Aaron and his sister Miriam had led the Hebrew people out of the land where they had been for hundreds of years living in captivity. But the people grumbled. They complained. They looked back on those days of slavery and could only see the rosiness of it. They forgot the hardships. Nostalgia can be like that. And so as they were traveling the path to freedom, even though God had been with them in the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire leading them forward, in the waters of the Red Sea parting, in the manna and the quail given to feed them, they still managed to forget. Now, the Hebrew people were camped at Rephidim. They pitched their tents, they set up their belongings, and it was just as the women were beginning to prepare dinner that someone noticed the problem. There they were, camped at a place with no water. There was no river, no stream, no pond, no possible well, no signs of rain. There was no water. Nothing for cooking or cleaning or drinking. And so, concerned for their families, people started going from tent to tent, hoping that maybe someone had brought along a skin of water, a little extra to share. But as the search became more frantic, as no water turned up, the people began to move from concern to panic. They certainly forgot that God had been with them in the gift of manna. In this new crisis, they forgot. They forgot God's providence. They needed water. They were afraid. You know, I asked the kids during the children's message if they'd ever been thirsty, and of course I got the typical kid response. But water's a problem. It really is. I mean, we're very fortunate. We can turn on the tap and have it come out, and it's clean, it's safe. I remember, though, back in 2008, I was in Sierra Leone, living on the schooner Amistad, and we had a water problem. You see, the water in Sierra Leone was not safe. At least most of it wasn't. We were anchored just off of the Navy base in Freetown. And the Sierra Leonean sailors would drink the water, but we couldn't. Our stomachs weren't equipped to deal with all of the bugs that were there. Now, Amistad is, an ocean-going vessel. It's got water purification and desalination capability. But we were anchored in the Sierra Leone River, a river that was so dirty that even Amistad's equipment couldn't make the water drinkable. And so, a couple times a week, we would take our small boat to shore, a 12-foot Zodiac, and we would load it to the gunnels with 5-gallon water cooler jugs that we had to purchase at a fairly hefty price. And we'd bring it out, and we would toss them up on deck to the person and empty them into the ship's water tanks. And then we'd take the empty jugs back to the Navy base, where we would fill it up with the water from the tap and bring that back out and use that for deck water. water for cleaning, but nothing that would touch food or would go in anybody's mouth. It was a real problem. It was a lot of work. But we were lucky. We could at least afford the water. You see, in Sierra Leone, water was extremely expensive. And back in 2008, Sierra Leone was the poorest country on earth. The people had, well, to say an unreliable water source would be an understatement. The government was very proud of having put in this water pipeline that was supposed to provide for the people, but because the people couldn't afford the water, they tapped into the pipeline illegally. And yes, they got water out, but other things also got in. And so the water that had been purified, by the time it made it all the way down to Freetown, was still not potable. In the world today, there are more than 780 million people who lack access to clean water. That's more than double the population of the United States. And every year, more than 3.4 million people die of water-related diseases. Women and girls, and yes, this is a female issue, spend 152 million work hours every day hauling water. Going to a well that is distant from their homes. Getting water from sometimes very questionable water sources. 152 million hours a day. That's time spent not getting an education, not earning a wage, not caring for their families. 152 million work hours every day. Now, let me help you get your mind around that number. The lost productivity of people collecting water in the world is greater than the combined number of hours worked in a week by the employees of Walmart, UPS, McDonald's, IBM, Target, and Kroger combined in a week. It's a real problem. And we come together as God's people in the United States. And it's easy for us to distance ourselves from that. After all, we just turn the tap. Or at least most of us do. You know, in 1972, the Clean Water Act transformed America for the better, banning pollutants that were making their way into our water systems. Not just the water we drink, but the water that we use for recreation, the water that we fish in, the water that we swim in, the water that we go boating upon. The Clean Drinking Water Act went even further. But even so, we still see problems. We see chemical contamination, like the Elk River chemical spill this past January, when 7,500 gallons of chemicals leaked from tanks belonging to Freedom Industries, a company that provides chemicals to the coal industry. And following that spill, more than 300,000 residents of West Virginia couldn't drink their water. Then there's the Dan River disaster in North Carolina, where Duke Energy released 35 million gallons of coal ash containing arsenic, lead, and mercury into North Carolina's Dan River. Oh, and just in case you're curious, just this past Thursday, North Carolina cited the company again for an additional 61 million gallons of ash and untreated water that they released into the Cape Fear River. Closer to home, hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, is the big issue as New York State debates whether or not to allow this technology that, at its best, we can call questionable. What will it do? Well, when you look at places where it's been used and you've seen aquifer destruction, it's not hard to imagine. We may have clean water mostly, but we still have problems. And then there's climate change. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has projected increased drought, particularly in the West and the Southwest. Interestingly enough, the area where we're seeing the fastest population growth, we're seeing decreased water. And according to the World Bank, there are currently 1.6 billion people around the world who are experiencing water shortages, and they expect that number to rise to 2.8 billion. Yes, that's billion with a B, by 2025. But let's get back to the scripture. Let's get back to those Hebrews that we left dehydrated in the desert. Many of them had grumbled. Was Moses leading them out into the desert to kill them? That they would die of thirst? That's what they accused Moses of. They weren't able to trust God. They weren't able to trust God's leadership. And so Moses turned to God with a question that I expect every pastor has asked about their congregation. What am I going to do with these people? Come on, you know it's true. They're about to stone me. Well, I'm sure no pastor here has ever felt that. Now that God had Moses' attention, though, God commanded him to take that very same staff with which he had struck the waters of the Nile, turning them into blood, that staff that he had held aloft over the sea of reeds to part it so that the Hebrews could pass through with dry sandals, and to strike a rock. And so Moses, in front of everybody, took that staff and hit the rock that God had showed him. And the water came forth, and the people were saved. It's a great story, isn't it? Of God bringing sustenance to a parched people. But you know, there's more to the story than meets the eye. You see, in the desert regions of the Middle East, much of the water has a fairly high mineral content. And as the water begins to seep up through the sand, the sun coming down upon it evaporates the liquid, leaving behind the minerals, often forming a mineral cap over top of a stream. And I hate to break it to you, but it's an old Bedouin trick to go looking for these mineral caps. And to, yes, take your staff and break the mineral cap to find the water flowing beneath. It's not much of a miracle, except that it's completely a miracle at the same time. the miracle of God showing the people how to find what they needed. In the middle of the desert, where they didn't know how to find what they needed. I often quote a rabbi friend of mine who likes to say that the definition of a miracle is being in the right place at the right time with the help of God. And for God to bring Moses and the Hebrew people to this hidden stream, and to give Moses the word of how to open it up, is indeed a miracle. Something that perhaps seems a little disillusioning if you're comparing it to, Cecil B. DeMille's version of miracles. But is in fact life-giving, restorative, and transformative all at the same time. To show that beneath the rocky crust, there's water flowing. That's true for us today, too. We can look at the water problems of the world and we can wring our hands over chemical spills. We can shake our heads at how sad it is that more than 10% of the world's population lack clean water. We can give up because the problem is too big and we can't imagine what we could do about it. Or we can trust God to be with us in the desert as we combat climate change. We can trust God to be with us as we support governments and humanitarian organizations that dig wells in sub-Saharan Africa, or build high-tech water condensing billboards in Peru, or that build water purification facilities in India. We can trust God to be with us as we email, call, and visit our government representatives, and as we work to make sure that legislation will be put forward to keep corporations from despoiling water for the sake of private profit. Because that can be part of our Lenten discipline, but it can and should be part of our ongoing practice of faith as well, as we care for God's creation and for the needs of our brothers and our hardworking sisters around the world. It was to just such a hardworking sister that Jesus came when he was there at the well in Samaria that day, so long ago. When he met the woman who had come carrying her water jug to gather the water for her household. When he told her the living water that he could offer. It's a bit different from the plain old wet stuff that Moses opened up for the people. Because while the physical needs were important, Jesus offered something different. This woman had all the water she needed. She had a well and a rope and a bucket. And Jesus didn't. What do you mean? She laughed at him. Give me living water. You don't even have a bucket. But as she encountered Jesus, the foreigner, the man, the one who would normally look down on her, and found instead one who honored her, she found her life changed. Here was one whose living water transformed the soul. And she went back, having experienced the grace of Christ, to tell all of her friends about it. I imagine that if she had been living today, she would have pulled out her phone and tweeted about it. It's evangelism. telling people where we find water, either the wet kind or the living kind. But there she was with living water filling her soul, and she couldn't keep it to herself. May we then, as those who follow in her footsteps, share the water that fills our souls. May we share the good news of Christ within us and among us. And as we do so, may we also share the concern that God has always shown for those who are thirsty. Amen.